Hey there, I'm Sarah Porritt, and you are tuning in to the Hear Us Roar podcast. Join me for inspired conversations with Asian women, chatting about how ideas and passions can ignite truly transformative journeys. On today's episode, you'll learn about how Eliza Blank was able to honor her personal ambitions, her mother, and the Filipino side of her heritage by launching the Sill, an incredibly chic website with several retail locations across the U.S. that makes picking out and buying houseplants super fun and easy. Perhaps influenced by the Plants of Instagram movement, I've acquired quite a green thumb over the years. I look forward to tending my little plant babies every Saturday morning, watering them, checking to see how they've grown, and trying to figure out whether or not they're happy in their little corner. Eliza and I definitely bonded over how personal our relationships with our plants can be.
People didn't really connect with plants on a low level. They were connecting on it on a very, very deep level. People were naming their plants. They were calling them their babies. You know, we really coined plant parenthood because we were listening.
I saw that hashtag too.
Yeah.
That's a really cute one.
I mean, it's amazing to me to think that these hashtags that exist are things that we've literally coined ourselves. And we coined them, but I should say, you know, the real credit is in the people and the customers, because we just actually heard it and played it back because our customers were coming in and saying, oh, my plant baby is struggling or my plant baby is thriving. And we're like, wow, these are, you know, plant parents.
And being a plant parent in New York City can be a bit frustrating. I rely primarily on public transportation, and frankly, I'm tired of the limited selection of potted plants available at my local bodega. Before we get into how Eliza got her seedling of an idea to blossom into a business that raised $13 million in funding, let's chat with her about her early years growing up in Western Massachusetts.
So it's interesting. So I grew up in Western Massachusetts, as you mentioned, in a town called Northampton. The area is dynamic in the sense that it's part of what's known as the Five College area. So I grew up in Northampton, which is where Smith College is. You also have Amherst, UMass Amherst, Mount Holyoke, Hampshire. So in some ways, it's a very academic center, which means there's a lot of culture there because of that. But there's also sort of this discrepancy between what the universities bring and what has just always existed. And the community that has largely been in Western Massachusetts, I would say, is just not as diverse as the community that the universities bring in. So there's a part of the year where the town feels incredibly dynamic and there's a lot going on. And looking down Main Street, it seems like you see diversity. My high school, as an example, was, I don't know, maybe even just like a 5-minute walk from Main Street. But you're like looking forward down Main Street, you see diversity. You look back towards my high school. Nothing. So, you know, I'm half Filipino and Jewish. The only other person who was half Filipino and Jewish was my brother. And we grew up knowing that we were different because people told us we were. You know, I don't look back with all that much resentment, and kids are kids, and there wasn't really an opportunity for even their parents to educate them as to who we were or what our beliefs were or, you know, how we were different. So I don't blame anyone, but it definitely was tricky. I mean, it's difficult not to see yourself represented out in the world. And so you feel, you know, a little bit more isolated.
Yeah. And how did your parents kind of explain that to you? Because I feel like you've really come to terms and you have that perspective of what that other person might be dealing with or the lack of information from their end.
Yeah, you know, it wasn't really a topic of conversation that we ever addressed as a family. I don't know if that's given the time. I've never actually had that. It's a great question because I've never had that conversation. And again, I don't think part of me feels like it gave me the chip on my shoulder that I needed to do what I'm doing. And so I love that in so many ways.
I resonate with that in so many ways.
I think it motivates me. It's like, okay, if I'm different, I'm going to be extra different. And I'm going to just lean in super hard to that. And that's propelled me forward. So I think even in retrospect, I've just never had the conversation with my parents because I think it is so fundamental now to who I am. And I love being who I am.
And so I take it that sort of take on being mixed race and having that edge in that way because of that, that's carried itself through even until now.
Absolutely. And I think, but it did have influence. So my brother was first to leave the house to go to school, and he chose to go to NYU. I followed and also went to NYU, and it really should be no surprise to anyone that we both ended up in New York City, because here we feel, we're definitely not different. Everybody here,
It's hard to be different in New York City, I feel.
And in so many ways, I think we really needed that. I mean, I can't speak for him, but I certainly needed that for like a minute to just breathe and be like, all right, people aren't looking at me because they're looking at like the crazy guy across the street who's wearing, whatever. It had a big influence, but it also is why I started the business that I started. I love going home, and I love, I would even contemplate moving back.
Mm-hmm. Well, especially now that you have a family, I could see why.
Yeah, I do love that like small town mentality. I mean, I drove by cows on my way to high school. My friends would work the cornfields. I went to school with potato farmers. We had an agricultural vocational school in my hometown, so kids that I went to middle school, some of them ended up going to an agricultural vocational school instead of high school. Like that doesn't happen in Westchester.
That's true. And I know that your mom, being Filipino and having a lot of houseplants, had a big impact in why you started the Sill. Do you feel like the community that you were in also had a similar impact?
Absolutely. I mean, I would actually describe my hometown as very crunchy and a little hippie, and they love that about themselves. So I grew up in homes that just were full of houseplants, and I also thought that was perfectly normal. I didn't realize that was actually somewhat unique to our particular community. But my mother, of course, took it a step further because, she grew up, climbing mango trees at home, and she, in many ways, I think, became a gardener and a houseplant keeper for that same reason, as like holding on to a piece of the environment that she came from. It's a very emotional category.
Yeah, for sure. It's nostalgic for me too. My mom's become even more of a plant lady these days.
Oh yeah, same.
Yeah, so that's great that you're continuing that legacy. So what did you study in college? Did it have anything to do with this?
No. So, I mean, there was no way that I could have looked back and thought I was going to be doing what I'm doing now. When I entered college, I studied communications. It was a very sort of generalized education. I mean, media, culture, communications. I think there is a part of me that was always interested in brand, even before brand was called brand, and marketing and the consumer experience. But I didn't know how to articulate that, and I didn't know what that really meant for me in terms of what to study. But obviously, it's landed me where I am.
Yeah. So what was your first gig right out of college? Where did you work?
Yeah. So I actually started as an intern at an agency here in New York called Wolf Olins. I started on the account side. I ended up graduating into the strategy team.
And what made you actually want to go into the agency world in the first place?
I thought it was so sexy. I thought it was fun and dynamic, and I was just so inspired by the creative element. I knew I wasn't a creative in the conventional sense of I wasn't a graphic designer, but it just being able to see the strategic thoughts brought to a visual identity just like gave me goosebumps.
After spending about 2 years on the agency side, Eliza jumped over to the brand side by joining what was at the time a startup in the hair care space called Living Proof. They were actually a client of hers at Wolf Olins for many months before making their commercial debut, and then Eliza joined the team as their first marketing hire.
So I was at Living Proof for nearly 4 years, maybe actually a little bit more, and it was a tremendous experience. I could not have started the Sill without having spent the time at Living Proof that I did. And the reason being is that they were an early stage company. I got to see how to operationalize an idea. I got to see actually what falls flat on its face going from an agency to a client in action once you try and operationalize it. There were just so many lessons to be learned. And because I was young and because I was early, meaning I was like first of 12 employees, I just got exposure to things that you wouldn't normally get exposure to. So I was sitting in on supply chain meetings and business development and strategy and sales and fundraising, and just I had a front row seat to what it meant to start and build something. And at the end of the day, at the end of 4 years, I was exhausted and thinking, if I'm going to work this hard, it's going to be for myself. And I'd always actually had this idea then of creating a consumer brand for plants. It sounds so strange, and it still kind of does, but going back in time to my days at the agency, the Sill was an idea that I had even then. I just didn't know what to do with it.
How did you come up with that idea?
So it was really simple, actually, because there was a lot of activity happening at the time around brand. As I mentioned, at this point in time, this is now like 2007, brand didn't mean what it means today. It was kind of early days of talking about brand as opposed to advertising or as opposed to marketing. And direct-to-consumer online was also still in its nascent stage. But people were doing it, and I was paying attention, and I was excited by it. And I think I also even then had the entrepreneurial spirit that would suggest that I might want to go build something. And it so happened that in the meanwhile, I'm moving into my first apartment. I'm thinking about, how to make my life feel more sustainable, meaning how do I make it work here in New York City where it's a tough place to live. Mm-hmm. My first apartment was literally like 200 square feet up 6 flights of steps. And I had this really gross window that faced like the back alley where like pigeons would congregate.
That sounds like a dream, even though your thighs are probably so in shape.
Yeah, it was a lot of things, but it was not really suitable for humans or plants. Oh. But I took it upon myself to start incorporating plants in my space because it was a really inexpensive but beautiful way to fill, my studio, my like 100, 200 square feet. And the experience was just terrible. I was going to the bodega, I was going to Home Depot. I didn't know what I was doing. It didn't occur to me that I didn't know what I was doing until I was in the thick of it. Or on the other side of it, I had these plants. I didn't know what they were. I didn't know how to take care of them. I didn't even know what I was supposed to Google. So it was me thinking about brand, me living this experience, and then me thinking, well, this is it. I think this is actually a really interesting category to apply very basic principles of marketing and merchandising and consumer brand to.
Mm-hmm. And simplify the process for urbanites who ran into the same issues as you, right?
Yeah. I mean, I knew I wasn't alone. I think that was pretty clear and obvious. And we were also starting to see a lot of flower companies get reinvented. So 1-800-Flowers had always been around. Then you start to see like the Bloom That's and the Books and Urban Stems and some of these other sort of like sexy D2C brands try and take over the flower space. So, the poor houseplant deserved someone to pay attention to it, and it was just me.
Yeah. And did you do any consumer research to figure out what your market looked like, or was it just off of a gut instinct and you were like, this feels right? I feel like there's a market for this.
Yeah, I mean, I think the market research was just what was available in terms of, household penetration. But the instinct was this is a universally understood category, right? Like people have been incorporating plants into their home since ancient times.
Yeah.
It wasn't a new concept.
Right.
So I think there was something to be said about the fact that this is a universal category. It's easily understood conceptually, but maybe people don't specifically know how to take care of plants. And I got so excited thinking like, we just need to reinvent it.
And you did.
And here we are.
And here you are. And just like when I scroll through my Instagram feed and found the Sill and fell in love and followed, many, many other New Yorkers started to do the same. How did you start? I believe it was a Kickstarter, right?
So I worked on a business plan nights and weekends, and, I had to work up the courage to...
I understand that feeling.
Yeah, exactly. I had to work up the courage to leave my job that paid me money. And at the time, Living Proof, and still is based in Boston. So I knew I wanted to move back to New York regardless. So I knew I was leaving that job regardless. But it was a question of, do I go get another job, or is this my window of opportunity to start this business? And I think I felt like I was 26 at the time. I had, call it 5 years of professional experience. I had a resume. I had confidence that if it didn't work, I would just go get a job. And that could have been naive, but, again, here I am today.
That's a great way to look at it, though. It's like, what's the worst case scenario, right? Like nothing happens and you go back into the field.
That's so true. I was in a natural transition and it just felt like the right time to test.
Mm-hmm. And when did you feel like it was the right time for you to leave the job?
I left Living Proof in February of 2012. The Kickstarter was in April and the site initially launched in June.
Whoa.
So I left. And I didn't dive in entirely. I did do some consulting work on the side, but I had saved money. I knew that I wanted to do this, and I also luckily was living in Boston, so lower cost of living.
Oh, great.
I moved in with a dear friend of mine who was recently engaged, and her fiance at the time wanted to save for their wedding. Mm-hmm. So I said, well, the three of us go find a 2-bedroom apartment. Yep. We'll split the rent 3 ways and we'll both save for whatever. And then I moved back to New York, and lucky for me, I already had a partner at the time, so we moved in together. 2 adults in a 1-bedroom is much more friendly on the wallet than any other situation. We became domestic partners, so I could go on his insurance. We're married.
Makes things easier.
We're married today, so it all worked out.
Got a kiddo.
Yeah, with the kid and everything. So, I had to be really creative. Mm-hmm. But I went for it.
Sometimes we just need to take that leap. And boy, did Eliza do just that. While on the surface, an online houseplant business seems simple enough to maneuver, when you really get down to it, there's a lot of considerations and just as many surprises in getting the business to run smoothly. Did you run into any logistical challenges after you started your Kickstarter?
All of them.
Just because I feel like there's somewhat of a reason why people haven't really tapped into this space, right?
Yeah, it's tremendously complex. It's complex in so many ways. I mean, you're shipping a live good, across a country through all sorts of weather. You have, customers who will ultimately love the thing that you've shipped them, but then kill it inadvertently or not. You have agricultural departments who are working at the state level that you have to form relationships with and make sure that you're accommodating. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. It's a form factor that has just not been easy for anyone. But I think, bring it on. Like we said, we were committed to delivering a really wonderful experience, and I want to do and deliver on that, and we just work at it every single day to improve.
How did you guys even start to troubleshoot some of those challenges?
Oh, it's so funny. I mean, to think back on all of the test shipments, I mean, we still test ship everything, every new plant, every new planter, every new configuration.
Meaning you actually put it together and then you send it to yourself and make sure when you get it, it's not busted.
We're sending it, early days it meant who has a cousin in Chicago? We're sending it to anyone who will be willing to be on the receiving end to document the entire unboxing experience, to, give us their feedback. There's no shortcuts.
You just got to figure it out and put in the work.
Yeah.
And I understand you raised over $13 million in funding. How did you even go about doing that?
In many ways, starting at the agency really helped because it just takes a deck. It takes a good deck and a good narrative and strong business metrics, of course, but we had that. And it's a lot of storytelling, and it's a lot of just putting yourself out there.
And probably doing the homework, too, to be able to support it and validate all that information, right?
Yeah, I think it's to validate your own business. But what I always tell people who want to raise money, venture capital or otherwise, is understand the business model of who you're raising money from. Because people don't always go in with all of the information. And so they're trying to evaluate, whether it's venture capital again or otherwise, they're trying to evaluate a specific type of financing without all the right information. So do your homework and understand what is expected of you so that you can go in fully prepared and with your eyes wide open. I knew and understood venture capital, and so I wasn't as afraid of it. But it's not that it's easy. It's just that I was informed.
Right. So what does a typical day look like for you? You're not just spritzing the plants and singing to them.
I wish. No, I mean, honestly, actually, as the company evolves and gets bigger, I become more and more removed from the plants in some ways. But I have the luck of having a very diverse schedule. So now I have a young daughter. So I wake up at 6:30 every morning because she wakes up at about 6:45. And that has not changed for the last 350 days.
Have you always been an early bird?
No, I love sleeping and I really need it. So I go to bed early.
Okay.
That's how I've compensated. But I wake up early, I get her up, I hang out basically until she goes down for her first nap, she starts to get ready for her nap around 8:30. So I'm out the door on the dot at 8:30, at my desk at 8:45. And my day it's generally full of meetings and email and phone calls. I could be interviewing potential candidates to join the company. I could be on the receiving end of an interview for a press piece. I could be pitching investors. I could be presenting our performance to investors. I could be, leading our marketing team in a strategic exercise. It's so fun. It's so fun. It's 7 or 8 years. I never know what day it is. I don't even know what year it is. I don't even care.
This is actually true.
I'm
were
enjoying
talking
it.
about what day it was just a couple minutes
I think
ago.
people think sometimes that I'm full of it, but I actually
You're
just
not
don't
kidding,
know.
yeah.
Well, when you stop being able to sleep in on the weekends, it actually doesn't matter. So when your alarm goes off at 6:30 on
true.
Saturday, it doesn't really matter what day it is.
You're my hero. I don't know how you do it. How do you balance it all, though?
I don't.
You have an 11-month-old and you're here talking to me. I feel so bad.
No,
how the heck are you doing this?
Well, we said I went home. This is the great part about New York City is it's small. So I was able to go from my office home, be there for bedtime, and then come back out again. It takes help, right? I wouldn't be able to do this by myself, but I have a partner who meets me halfway. We're, lucky enough to have an amazing nanny who works with us and our daughter. So it takes a village, it's true, but there's no balance. I don't really even understand what that word means because I think it's just the balance comes in finding what works for you. So I guess, I would say most people look at my life and say it's not balanced, but it is for me. I like what I do.
I have to ask, what's your favorite plant and why?
So my favorite plant is a Philodendron. It's a very basic plant. Poor girl. I always say that. But she is
hard to kill.
So hard, so forgiving.
I need that. I need her in my life.
So forgiving. I bring them to the brink of death and then bring them back. It's so funny because everyone just assumes that I live in this big, beautiful, lush, happy jungle. But no, I have a lot of half-dead plants on my windowsill because I'm busy. But I surround myself with plants and I generally do take very good care of them and I dote on them. And the reason why the Philodendron is my favorite plant is because it is resilient and it is very fast growing. And so what a perfect metaphor for life.
It's just like you.
Yeah. It's what I aspire to be. Let's call it that.
Yes.
Yeah.
So just looking back at your life and your career so far, have you made any mistakes that you feel like has really taught you a lesson or changed the way that you view yourself?
Yes. Oh my gosh, yes. One, you make mistakes every other, moment of the day, and you have to get really comfortable with that. I think I meet and mentor a lot of young people now who, I hate that I can say that, young people. I'm no longer one of those people who really live in fear of making mistakes. And, you really, it's very difficult to learn and grow if you aren't willing to make mistakes. So I've embraced that, which I think is the right lesson and takes some time and maturity. But some of the bigger mistakes I've made are around who I surround myself with. What is going to bring you up and what is going to bring you down? And the reality is we don't have time to surround ourselves with people who bring us down. So, that sounds so cheesy, but people think, if you've started your own business, you're creating this beautiful oasis of all your favorite people, right? But I've made lots of hiring mistakes. I've spent too much time with people who were the wrong people for me in a lot of ways. But those were some of my greatest lessons. And now I know not to do that.
Yeah. And that's good advice too, because sometimes it just takes time for you to figure out like who's a good friend, who's a good hire.
Yeah.
And as you grow older too and you evolve, that definition changes.
It absolutely does. I mean, what I accepted to be okay at 25 maybe was okay for me at 25, but it isn't at 35. Mm-hmm.
So just looking back at a younger version of yourself, do you have one or two pieces of advice that you would give yourself now that you've actually grown the Sill into what it is?
This ties back to what we were talking about earlier, but my advice to my younger self is embrace everything that makes you different and just lean in hard to that, because you're never going to want to be like anyone else ever again. That rings so true to me that, I spent the majority of my childhood thinking, I wish I were like everybody else. And now I genuinely do not feel that way. And I realize that I wasted a lot of time wishing that I were like everybody else. And now I'm so glad that I'm not.
For someone who's listening who wants to follow in your footsteps, do you have a recommendation on one thing that she can do tomorrow to get her a little closer?
I recently was talking with someone who is trying to make a transition in their career. And I think the questions that I asked them was, what do you want your day to look like and how do you want to feel? And usually that's like enough to unlock something in someone. And I didn't even recognize that maybe until a few years into my business. But at the end of each year, as I started thinking about the business plan for the following year, I started that exercise for myself of how do I want to spend my time and how do I want it to make me feel? And that's honestly what led the business and why I think, going back to your earlier question, we're so connected to our community, because it comes from that place in my heart.
I absolutely love that, because I'm very much like a feel person as well. And I just chase joy.
Yeah.
And wherever that leads me, it's totally great.
Yeah. No, I think it's right. And, we spend so much time at work. Like, it has to be meaningful.
Mm-hmm. So why not make it?
Yeah.
Create that meaning for yourself.
Absolutely.
So what's next for you and for the Sill? I know now you have five physical shops.
That's true.
East Coast, West Coast. You're all over the place.
Yeah. I think, what's got us to this point is taking risks and listening to the customer and sort of, reading between the lines of like what's next and what can we do or what should we do to deliver on this sort of core promise of connecting people to plants and to a community at large. So, we're trying a lot of different things right now, and we're super excited. And I think I'm just continually expanding the scope of what the Sill is and can be, and that's a really great place to be.
More green.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Eliza.
Oh, my
for your
pleasure.
time. And thank you for tuning into the Hear Us Roar podcast. If you connected with Eliza's journey, please comment and be sure to hit that subscribe button. Also, pop over to www.hurpodcast.com so that you can stay up to date on all the latest episodes. It's a great way for us to stay in touch so that I can continue to encourage you to see your passions blossom. I'm your host, Sarah Porritt, and until next time,